Okay, welcome back. And in the previous lesson, we create ourselves some extra classes for no player and one for player 1 and player 2 to be able to prepare to change the circle to different colors depending on which player was actually clicked the circle. And we have also gone to our game circle and we've managed to just make sure that we've passed in the class name to be able to dynamically change the class name of our circle. Now what we want to do in this lesson is actually change the class name corresponding to the value that's actually held in the appropriate circle. So let's do that. Now first of all, what I want to do is I want to tidy up all of this massive great repetition here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create ourselves a helper function, and it will simply just output this game circle component, and we just pass in the ID. So let's do that. So let's do const render circle, and we're going to just pass in the ID, and we're going to return our game circle components here. We can simply return JSX, so like this. So let's just do that, and let's tidy this up a little bit like this. And we don't need that, we can just simply do that. Okay, now just change this ID1 to ID. We're going to do something like this. We're going to use some backticks, a little JavaScript template, and we're going to dynamically change the class name like we have done previously. We're going to do player, then we're going to do $, and we're going to look at the state of the game board. So we're going to game board, and then we're going to look at the ID, and this ID we're passing in, for example, ID1 here, so we have a 0-based index. So we're going to do game board ID, make sure I've got my brackets okay here. Let's get rid of that one there, let's put that there. Okay, we are good with the render circle. So now what we can do is we can just simply take all of this here, get rid of it, all the way to the bottom like that, and now we can just do render circle with ID of 0 because we have a 0-based index for our array, just to make it a bit easier for ourselves. I'm just going to paste this in a few times, 0, 1, and just change the ID like this. Now we are going to make this even better, but for now it's going to create simply 8 circles, not worry about the other remaining 8 circles. Now let's quickly test that to make sure that works. Okay, so we have our circles we're expecting, 1, 2, 3, 4, I think I've got 9 rather than 8, it doesn't matter. So that little helper function certainly helps tidy things up a bit. Next thing I want to do is I want to create some constants, because at the moment we're filling this with 0 and then we're filling this with 1. So just to make it a little bit easier rather than using numbers, it's good practice to have some constants. So let's do const no player equals 0, const player underscore 1 equals 1, and const player 2 equals 2. Let's just change this declaration here to no player, and we're going to change that from 1 to player 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to create ourselves another state variable to hold the current player. We don't want to always have player 1 playing, it's going to have to be sometimes a player 2. So let's do const. We're going to have a simple number to hold this current player, so current player, and again we're going to have a function called set current player to be able to update that state, use state, and we're going to simply have a number here, and we're going to default it to player underscore 1 for now. Okay, so it's just a simple number. And then what we're going to do is we want to basically toggle between player 1 and player 2. So the first person that clicks the circle we will assume is player 1, and then we will toggle the current player to player 2, and if it's player 2 that's just clicked it, we will toggle it back to player 1, simply flicking the values between player 1 and player 2. So let's do that. What we're going to do now is we're going to change it from player 1 to current player, and then we're going to flip the player across. So we're going to do set current player, and we're going to use a ternary expression here. So we're going to check the value of current player. If it is equal to player 1, then we will set it to player 2. Otherwise, we will set it to player 1. So it's just a simple ternary toggle here. Okay, so we have now set the state of the game board corresponding to the value in our state. So what we want to try and do is basically pass in player 1 or player 2, depending on which player is clicked on the circle. So to do that, we can use a JavaScript template, like we have done in a previous lesson. So we're going to put it in curly braces, then do some backticks, put player underscore, and then game board, and then the corresponding ID. Now the actual array is 0 based. We need to give it an index of 0 for this. And to make our lives easier, let's actually update these ID to start at 0 rather than at 1. So let's just do the first couple just to see whether it works. So 0 and 1, and I'm just going to get rid of all these ones down here, and we'll come back to them in a minute just to save confusion. Let's now update the class name on this second one here, and that's going to be a game board at the element index of 1. So we have an ID of 0, a game board of 0, an ID of 1 and a game board of 1, so that matches okay. And then when it comes through our circle click function, we're going to pass in either 0 or 1. It will change the ID at the array of 0, 1, and it should go to 1. Then it updates the property and sends the corresponding class name down to our game circle component, which will then change the CSS class, player 1 or player 2, and we expect it to go red or blue. Well, that's the theory anyway, so let's just give that a save and see what happens. Okay, so we've got the two circles in white, and let's click on it, and nothing happens. So that's not what we're expecting. We're expecting it to change colour. So let's open the debugger tools. Now this is something you're probably using a lot when you're using React Development. It is our friend at the debugger tools. So let me introduce you to the tools that you need to help debugging here. So the first one is the React Teams plugin here, which is the React Components. Now to get to that, so if you haven't got this Components tab, I certainly recommend you download the React Diagnostic Tools. To get that, go to your Manage Extensions in Chrome, and then do a search for React. And you should see React Developer Tools, and just click the install link. And when you do, you will get this little Components tab here. And that's very handy because you can see it gives you a list of all the components on our page, which is game boards and then game circles like here. If we click on that, we then get the properties being passed in. So you can see we've got a class name of player 0 and the ID in our function, and this one here has got an ID of 1. So that's good. So when we actually click these components, we would expect to see these properties change, but they're not. So if I actually manually change that from player 0 to player 1, you can see that it will actually update the color there. So the problem is not our game circle component, which is here. That is correctly updating the CSS, and it's not a problem with the CSS itself because we know that it is actually coloring the circle. So our issue is that our properties aren't changing. If we go to our console here, we can see that our array does indeed start off, and as we're clicking it, it is actually updating the array to the corresponding number here, 1. So in theory, these should be going red, but they're not. So what's the problem? So this is where we can then turn to our friend Google. We're going to do a search for something like React Array not causing re-render. Something like that anyway, and seeing what comes up. So the very first entry is a Stack Overflow article here. So let's open that and see what it says. Something very similar. Let's have a read through here and see what the recommended solution is. So someone here has got some similar, they've got an array and the array is not actually updating and they're wanting to know why. So the suggestion is that what you're doing here is a mutation. What they're doing here is pretty similar to what we are doing in our code. When we're setting the element of the array to the value, we are doing exactly the same as in this answer here. So it appears we are actually mutating the state. So the important bit is here. You should avoid mutation when updating your state. If you mutate your state, React cannot understand your state has changed. So that's the important bit. And they suggest you use methods like map or filter or any other method which does not mutate your state, along with an example here. Now if we scroll down and see what the other solutions are, you can also see someone says you're wrongly updating the state. If we've got an array, by assigning it to a constant is not the correct way to clone the array. We need to use the spread operator. So we need to do something like this. We need to assign a constant to our game board array, and then we can do the update expecting and then call the function to update the state. So let's give that a go. So we're going to do something like this. We're going to do const board, and then we're going to do a spread operator, then game board, and now we're going to change this from game board to board, and then we're going to call set game board on this copy of the array. So what we're doing here is we're not actually modifying or mutating the original array, we are making a copy of our state array, and then we're actually modifying the copy of the array and then setting the state with the copy of the array rather than the original array. So that's the key difference when you're using arrays in state. The reason why I didn't do it this way at the beginning is because I wanted to show you what happens when you are using React for the first time. It's very easy to fall into this trap, especially if you have things like arrays, to not realize you have to actually make a copy of the array. Let's give that a save and see what happens. So we have a blank array here. Now we can click the button, and immediately as soon as we do that, we can see it does correctly change the color as we're expecting. That is one way of being able to update the state when you have an array. However, what we did originally, where we actually just simply updated the state, is fine for everything other than arrays. If you have a primitive state variable, it's perfectly acceptable to be able to call that set method without having to make a copy of it. So what do I mean by that? Well, so let's create an example and I'll show you what I mean. Let's have a const, and then we're going to do current player, and then have set current player, and this is going to be simply an integer or a number, and we're going to set that to a default value of 0. No, we're going to set it to a default value of 1 for the first player. And then when the second player comes along, we're going to change this current player from 1 to 0. What we want to do is be able to toggle between the two players. The first person to play will be player 1. We want to set this current state variable from player 1 to then player 2, and then back to player 1. So basically flip-flopping between player 1 and player 2. So we can do something like this. We can do set current player equals 1. If it does, then we can set it to player 2, otherwise we set it back to player 1. Now you can see that we literally just updated the state variable here, and we didn't have to worry about making any copies like we did for the array. And the reason is because when using primitives in the state, you can simply just update them, because you'd be actually updating the value in the state. Whereas when you have an array, it's effectively got a reference to that array, not the actual instance of the array in the state, okay? So effectively what you need to do is make a clone of that array and then reset the state to the clone every time you've got an array. What I want to do now is create some constants, because having values like 1 and 2 doesn't quite make sense. So let's have something like const no player, set that to 0, and then const player 1, set that to 1, and const player 2, set that to 2. Let's default our use state from 1 to player 1, and then what we're going to then do is update the board ID from 1 to current player. So that will then correctly set the elements at the index in the board to the current player, whether it's 1 or 2. And then immediately that's done that, you can then check whether the player is currently 1, which we're going to change to player 1. And then if it is player 1, we're going to update it and change it to player 2, which I have not got in my constants here. Otherwise, if it's player 2, we're going to set it back to player 1. Okay, let's actually output the current player in addition to the game board, so we can keep an eye on that. And now let's give that a save. We can double check things are working correctly and keep our console handy. So we've got our components here. So the first one is currently player 0, the second one is currently player 0. Let's click on it. This now changes to player underscore 1. And if you look at our console, we now have an output of player 1. Let's click it again. We now have a player 2. And if we click on our components, tab and then highlight the second instance of the game circle, we can see it's set to player 2. If we click it again, it now goes back to player 1. So if we click the first one, that's going to player 2. So we are now flip-flopping between the two players. We've now made a little step forward into implementing our game. Now the next thing I want to do is certainly a bit of a pain to be able to have this multiplied 16 times. Let's create ourselves a little helper function to be able to simply output this game circle, and then we can simply call that helper function 16 times, and it's going to then output all these properties for us. Okay, let's do const render circle, and we are going to accept an ID, and we're going to return our game circle, and we're going to get rid of this bit here and just pop that there, and we're going to change ID from a 0 to ID, and the game board is now going to be ID. And then what we can do is we can now call that function and do render circle with an ID of 0, and we simply copy and paste that a certain number of times and just change the ID for each of the circles. Let's just do 8 of them for now, and let's test that to see if that's working fine. Okay, we can see we got the instances of our game circle here, and we should have some IDs associated with them, so that's working okay. Now if we click on it, we can then start to alternate between the players, filling up the circles as expected. So we're certainly getting a lot closer to implementing our functionality. Okay, so that's quite a lot to take in this lesson, so we're going to take a break here. And in the next lesson, I'm going to actually show you another way of updating the state for an array, because while this is working perfectly fine, it's still not the recommended way of updating arrays, and you'll see why in the next lesson. So see you there.